Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. This is the sixth and final episode on American wine and spirits heritage. We started with bubbly on the banks of the Ohio River, drank some Catawba Pink. This led us to America's Blush Crush and White Zinfandel, then on to the mother lode of old Zinfandel vines planted around the Gold Rush out west. After the bubbly and the Blush Crush, the Zinfandel and the Gold Rush, we stayed out west and learned about the Meritage heritage. Then we had a bourbon palate cleanser that brought us back east to Kentucky, which was really once Virginia, so why not bring it all home? I have a special connection with Virginia, as I spent 2 of my 4 years of high school there, go King George Foxes. And just down the beach from me was the home of 2 gentlemen who began a winery, and I remember visiting their home one evening with my first boyfriend. Long story, he was of their employ at one time. But other than that evening, I had forgotten all about Virginia wine until about a decade ago, and then I finally got to visit a few vineyards in 2019. So I am very excited about this piece of American wine history that touches a bit of my personal history, so let's wrap Virginia wine. We're going to wander the wine regions, gab about the grapes, and flaunt a few firsts in Virginia and American wine history. Yes, wine has been made in Virginia for hundreds of years, and as far back as the late 16th century, we can find evidence of Sir Walter Raleigh commenting on Roanoke Island's mother vineyard. Vines everywhere, climbing the trees, I say. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. And thus, we delve into the history of wine in Virginia. In the bourbon episode, I mentioned the English settlement of Jamestown. In the early 1600s, it turns out that the Virginia Company of London, on mandate from King James I in England, had sent their 3 ships yonder to the New World to establish said colony. You may recall they'd brought distilling skills with them, and they were key to the beer and the tavern culture established in this country, but they also brought with them some wine from the old world. And why not? As or Raleigh himself said, vines everywhere, I say, vines on America's East Coast. Even the Vikings said so, back in 1000 when they named us Vinland or Vineland. But these were the native grape varieties, not of the Vitis vinifera or traditional Old World winemaking sorts. And the wine that the settlers were attempting to make with our crazy New World grapes, well, let's just say it was a little bit barnyardy or foxy. Funky. This same Virginia Wine Company that enabled Jamestown settlers to row on over here also enabled one each Lord Delaware to bring the first Vitis vinifera vines from the old country to the colonies. But alas, the vines wouldn't do well here. We would find out later this was due to the phylloxera louse resident in our very own soils. But wait, we gotta back up the funky grape truck for a hot minute because we might be asking, who was Lord Delaware, importer of vines? Isn't Delaware up the coast a little bit? Of course it is. Thomas West. He was actually the 3rd Baron de la Warr, W-A-R-R, sounds like Delaware, and Virginia's first governor. So yes, this Delaware dude tried to bring in traditional wine grapes, but no joy would be squeezed from them. By 1619, the House of Burgesses were ruling Virginia, and they grew out of the General Assembly of Virginia that I mentioned in the bourbon episode that laid down the law on how many pounds of tobacco was worth certain distilled hooch. This iteration of the colony's government also issued an act with an E, Act number 12, that thou shalt plant vineyards in ye old Virginia. So even as we moved into the next century, and we all know about our founding fathers' fondness for the local and the fine imported hooch, we got George Washington, James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson, all enabled by Ben Franklin. They're all credited with creating and or being shareholders of that Virginia Wine Company established in 1774, along with Tuscan grower Filippo Mazze, who also brought over some vines. And that is a cool winery visit in Tuscany, by the way. Mazze is still there. And it was actually Jefferson, the real cork dork of the bunch here. He liked Mazze. He liked him so much that he said, please, won't you please won't you be my neighbor? And even gave him 193 acres that are still part of today's Monticello winery property. So yes, they were able to make some wine with the vines that frost didn't kill that first year. Then came the Revolution, and even Mazze joined the fight. He even helped out with our Declaration of Independence. I didn't know that. That whole all men are created equal bit, that was Mazze's little ditty. Grazie molto, Filippo. Unfortunately, the vines at Mazze's house were destroyed by horses when he rented out his property to Baron von Riedesel, while Mazze scooted back to Tuscany to try and score some cash from the Grand Duke of Tuscany for our Revolutionary War. So it wasn't just the House of Bourbon pitching in. Long winery story short, what was started as the Virginia Wine Company would be picked up on about 100 years later when the Monticello Wine Company set out to establish this part of Virginia outside of Charlottesville as a real, no kidding, important wine region in 1873. And one could say all was going swimmingly until the Prohibition plague, which put the kibosh on the whole enterprise in 1916. Like many other wine regions in the United States, Virginia's modern viticulture and enology industry wouldn't come into its own really until 200 years after Jefferson asked Mazzei to be his vineyard neighbor. In the 1970s, so that's where we are, that's when the wine culture was kind of hit or miss, at least in this country. But nevertheless, there was a handful of persistent Virginia vignerons that kept calm and vined on. Before the new millennium, Virginia would have around 50 wineries, and today there are over 300. 300! And to throw some more numbers at you to blow your mind, they have 4,000 plus acres under vine, 10 wine regions, 8 AVAs, and we talked about those American viticultural areas in the Amador episode. That's linked if you want a refresher. Well, there's a ninth kind of AVA, but we'll get to that. In fact, one of the AVAs you've already heard of in that Amador episode, if you're listening to these podcasts in sequence, which are not a requirement, we talked about the California Shenandoah Valley, almost heaven, the whole thing. I referenced a multi-state AVA back east known as the Shenandoah Valley that straddles 10 counties in Virginia and 2 in West Virginia. Fun fact, both the California Shenandoah Valley and the Shenandoah Valley of West Virginia/Virginia were established on the same date according to the TTB's handy-dandy list of American viticultural areas listed by establishment date, in this case, 28 December 1982. And that brings us to the wine regions of Virginia. The Shenandoah Valley of which I speak today, besides being an absolutely gorgeous area to drive through in the autumn, particularly on the Blue Ridge Parkway, instead of being adjacent to the motherlode of the Gold Rush era like its California namesake, it's bordered to the east by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Virginia Wine website lists almost 40 wineries here, but some are also meaderies and cider producers, so bonus. Please call ahead to make sure they have a tasting room. And in addition to all this fun and beauty, the Shenandoah Valley boasts Virginia's highest vineyard altitude at 3,300 feet. Moving counterclockwise and west, we move to Highland County. This is where we find the Virginia Mountains region. This is what they call the Switzerland of Virginia. And of course, the mountains give the whole thing away, like alpine climate. And the virginiawine.org website says that all of the counties east of the Mississippi, Highland has the greatest mean elevation. I found 13 wineries here, 2 a meadery and 2 cider producers as well. The furthest west reaches of the state has 3 vineyards in another beautiful rural area known as the Heart of Appalachia. So, without lingering too long here, we're going to start moving east back toward Highland County. Again, we're going counterclockwise, but we have to get through the Blue Ridge region. This runs from the North Carolina border north to almost Roanoke. 15 wineries, meaderies, and cider producers are in this part of the state. And within this region, in parts of 2 counties, Montgomery and Roanoke County in southern Virginia, we find a teeny tiny AVA known as the North Fork of Roanoke, established in April 1983. Some liken this AVA to the Rhone Valley in France because of the cool mornings and gravel soils. I'll let you know when I get back from there this fall. And almost directly south is the Rocky Knob AVA, which lives in parts of Floyd and Patrick County, also in the Blue Ridge growing area. It was established, too, in 1983 and is the smallest of the true AVAs of Virginia. You know, a teeny tiny piece of an AVA lives in this area of Virginia and is shared by Tennessee and North Carolina. It's called Appalachian High Country. Now, this was founded in October 2016, and only one Virginia county is part of this 2,400-acre AVA. That's Grayson County. I don't even see it mentioned on the Virginia website. And the reason has to do with wineries within this AVA not being yet part of the Commonwealth. So that was as of this article I found 6 months ago, also linked in the show notes, but we'll just stick with the 8 real AVAs and keep moving. Since we're in Southern Virginia, let's scoot on east and stop right smack in the middle of the Virginia-North Carolina border along Highway 58. This is the Southern Virginia growing region with about 11 producers. We're going to look north toward the Shenandoah Valley, and we find in the center of the state, what else but the growing region of Central Virginia. And within Central Virginia's growing area and bumping up against that Shenandoah Valley where we started, we find the Monticello AVA. It was established in 1984, January 1984. In fact, it was established a week before the Billy Idol concert I attended in the now 100-year-old Stanley Theater in Pittsburgh. 2 commonwealths are in my misspent youth past, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which we talked about in the whiskey episode, and the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so speaking of, Monticello AVA. This cuts through 5 counties. It's famous not only because of Thomas Jefferson's shack, where he asked Filippo Mazzei to please be his neighbor back in the 1700s, but around central Virginia, we can find about 90 producers of wine, mead, cider. There's Civil War stuff there. There are bigger cities like Richmond, Lynchburg, and Charlottesville. And it's a huge region in the central part of the state. So what's left to explore, you ask? Well, let's see. The southernmost tip of the state, bordering at the Atlantic Ocean. I see you, Virginia Beach. It's the Hampton Roads growing area with a crap load of stuff to do here, as you can guess. Oh, and remember that first barely successful English colony from the early 1600s, Jamestown? Yep, that's here, along with more deep-seated American colonial history. I mean, yeah, there's wine tasting here, but everything else from Busch Gardens Amusement Park to famous old universities to the beaches. Norfolk, one of my favorite eating towns, is in this area. The Ghent district, an absolute favorite. How many wineries, you ask? About a dozen, including some meaderies. And this is not a commercial, but this does bring us, maybe a little too enthusiastically, back to where our American booze heritage can trace a lot of its origins. I mean, we're almost back to where we started. Did I forget the AVA here? Oh, how could I? Because it didn't exist when I was there 4 years ago. So please welcome the Virginia Peninsula AVA, which was established not even 2 years ago in August of 2021. It's coming up on its second birthday with lower elevations from 250 feet down to sea level, a warm, wet climate moderated by the ocean. It's easy to see why some beautiful full-bodied reds like Petit Verdot, along with some whites like Viognier and Chardonnay, do really, really well here. And then, oh, don't forget Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg. Yep, same historical one right in the middle of it. There are about 5 wineries just in this brand spanking new AVA, which is about 50 miles long and about 5 to 15 miles wide, depending on where you are in the AVA. We're going to move north up the coast, where we can find ourselves in my old stomping grounds, the Chesapeake Bay, in what is called the Tidewater region. It's between the Potomac and the York Rivers, and this is where we find the AVA known as, get this, Northern Neck George Washington Birthplace. Seriously, that's the name of it. Northern Neck George Washington Birthplace. Northern Neck GWB. Established April 1987. 5 counties are part of this AVA, including King George. It's known for its hybrids like the Chambourcin, Vidal Blanc, but we can find so many others like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Chardonnay, Albarino grows well here, and the Petit Verdot. And this is where we find one of the oldest Virginia wineries and the largest. It's called Ingleside, which is oddly the first Virginia winery I ever heard about back in the early 80s when it was just opened. Back to the tour, though. We head to the Eastern Shore, though. I hate when I do that. It's this tiny little strip of land between the Chesapeake Bay to its west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and this is where we find the Eastern Shore AVA, established on New Year's Day, 1991. There is one winery here that I found. Red, white, rosé, makes Cab, Merlot, Chard, includes a late harvest dessert wine. So it's kind of servicing the whole peninsula there, and good on you. The last stop on our wine region roundabout tour of Virginia brings us up to Northern Virginia. Where else? In northeastern Virginia, right next to our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. We're at 1 o'clock if we're going clockwise again, or counterclockwise again. The AVA, located on the northwestern reaches of this growing area and neighboring the Shenandoah Valley to its west, is the Middleburg, Virginia AVA. Middleburg was established in September of 2012 in 2 counties with nearly 100 producers in this wine region alone. You can find all the goodies here, the full-bodied Cabs, rosés, the bangin' Petit Mansang I have in my glass right now, and even a sparkling Norton. What? We'll get to that. That's a thing you gotta try when you're sipping around Virginia, I think. So what kind of wine are they making all around Virginia? I've mentioned a few, but they're making some first-rate juice for sure. You can find all the styles, sparklings, whites, reds, rosés, desserts, all the international culprits, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Merlot, Malbec, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, all of the Pinots, Noir, and Gris. You'll find some Italian specialties like Nebbiolo, southwestern France flagship grapes like Tannat and Petit Mansang. And speaking of, I am currently nursing my last bottle, Petit Mansang, now 6 years old. I cannot get over how redonkulous the acidity is on this still, how so much juicy, mouth-filling, ripe stone fruit like peach and tropical fruit like mango is slathering my palate, and the body and the finish on this thing still makes it one of my favorite finds in the whole one rainy ass day I got to spend tasting around Northern Virginia. And this sets us up nicely for the grape gab, as I've not even mentioned something else Virginia does like nobody's business. After a sip. Oh man, that is so good. Oh, so this isn't an ad, but I do want to mention the producer of this wine because it is so outstanding. It is a 2019 Petit Mansang from the Barnes in Hamilton. I need more. You can tell how much I love this wine. I did a little Virginia wine tasting when I got back, and of all the reds, and I got some really nice reds from like Duquesne and some of the other wines there, but this white, it was everybody's favorite of the evening, and it really surprised me because we had a variety of tasters that night. Okay, so back to the grapes. What does Virginia do like nobody's business besides this killer Petit Mansang? Hybrids. Yep, we got those. Cheval Blanc, Traminette, Vidal Blanc, all the whites. I mentioned Norton and Chambourcin for the reds, so we're going to hang out here for a hot second. The red Chambourcin has been around less than 80 years, developed in France's Loire Valley, but it grows well in Virginia and even the other Commonwealth I claim from my misspent youth, as I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania. But you know, I am down to the fringier finds of every wine region, and Virginia does several others well, Norton being one of them. So let's talk about Norton with our last cork dork alert of the season, because one simply cannot wrap VA wine without it. Yes, Norton. This is a Virginia original, first grown in Richmond only 100 years ago. Norton is named for the horticulturist and apparently a doctor named Daniel Norborn Norton. It has other names too, according to Wine Grapes and the UC Davis Foundation Plant Services website. Norton, Virginia, Norton's Seedling, Norton's Virginia Seedling, and Red River, and there are others too, but I don't want to bore you with those. Virginia Wine's website calls it America's oldest wine grape, stating also that not only was it kicking butt before all the butt kicking in the Civil War, my words of course, but in 1873 kicked some wine butt at the World's Fair in Vienna, where it was awarded the best red wine of all nations, and that is a quote. I can't drop the mic because it's on a stand, but just assume the mic has been dropped here, so there, boom. Ending on the best red wine of all nations is a great place, I think, to wrap up not only this Virginia wine wrap, but season 13, dedicated to the wine and spirits of this here nation of the US of A. It was incredible to see how many links to today's styles intersected with people and places and cultures and milestones in our nation's early history and how far we've come. And what a trip we've taken this season. Season 14 is going to begin in September, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer with whatever's in your glass. And I do want to make a little point of personal privilege here. I know some of you do know this, but I actually started the season not being able to see very well. I had a very minor stroke. It was during the break, and I had already written the first 2 episodes. So when I sat down to record, I was just getting my eyesight back or having to read with one eye covered. So that is how the season started, and I'm happy to report that my vision is back. I'm happy to be able to read this right now without an eye patch, and I'm on the mend. So I thank you for those of you who did see my little post on Instagram. I haven't made a huge deal out of it because it was very, very minor and I got very, very lucky. But for those of you that have stuck with me through the season and you didn't even notice, thank you so very much. I raise this last sip of my Virginia Petit Mansang in my glass to you, all of you, for making room for me in your podcast feed. I know you have so many options. There is so much content out there, a lot of great wine content. One can only listen to so many booze pods. So I am honored that you are here with me and that you take me with you wherever you go. For example, shout out to Rachel, who enjoyed the bourbon episode on one of her recent walks. I love to hear what you think of these episodes. Finally, if you're listening on Stitcher, it goes away at the end of next month, but don't worry, you can find me on Overcast, Good Pods, Amazon Music, Audible, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Deezer, Odyssey, Podbean, Podcast Addict, and even Ghana in India, and apparently not the ones with the swear words in it. They don't put those on. And TuneIn, and of course, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and a bunch of not even mentioned because there are so many I probably am not aware of. You can reach out to me on email. Email me at val@glassandsession.com. And I noticed that my domain had switched some mailboxes recently. So I got an email from one of you guys in the end of June and I just found it. I'm really sorry that I missed it because it was no longer being forwarded to my professional email. So I will look for those a little bit more often. On the socials, you can find me on Mastodon at Glass and Session at epicure.social. Glass and Session is on Post. It is post.news at Glass and Session. I'm on Spoutable now, Glass and Session. I'm Vino with Val on Insta and Pinterest and on Facebook /Glass in Session. If you dig smartass cat content, you know my little podcat Smokerdoodles. He is at Nebelung_smoke_show. That's Nebelung Smoke Show on Instagram. I do check in there a little bit more often because it's very positive. It's very cute. its cats, and there's a great Nebelung community there. And there's also brand new Glass and Session swag and even podcast swag in my TeePublic store, linked way at the bottom of the show notes and on my website. And since I don't do sponsors or ads or Patreon, it's a small way to support the Winecast and keep Smokey well stocked in treats as he sits here on my lap while I create all this booze edutainment for you. I will see you in September, and thank you again for a wonderful season. Cheers. Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino With Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Website is glassandsession.com.